Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Josephine van der Walle. I'm the Artistic Director at Market Art Fair. Thank you so much for joining us today for Market Talks Artists First, the first edition of our series of talks and exchanges taking place online. Artists First presents a series of talks in which artists from across the Nordic region share their views and thoughts on art and artistic practices. Because while we cannot visit as many exhibitions as we would like today, we still think it's important to stay in touch with artistic ideas. And therefore, in this program, we let the artists speak first. The program consists of 5 artist talks, each time in conversation with an international curator. And with this program, we hope to offer you a glimpse of what will be on view at the upcoming Market Art Fair in September, taking place at Nikolaj Kunsthal in Stockholm from September 17 to 19. So I hope that you will join us then too. For the second conversation in Market Talks Artists First, I'm very excited to introduce you to the artist Nicolai Howalt. Howalt is a Danish artist showing with Martin Aspect Gallery in Copenhagen, and his photographic work spans across documentary, installation, and conceptual art. Here, Nicolai Howalt will be in conversation with Helene Nyborg, the director at Nikolaj Kunsthal in Copenhagen, where Nicolai Howalt actually showed his series Old Chico only last summer. And for the series, he photographed the tree Old Chico, which is a 9,550-year-old tree up in Sweden. And this series will also be on view at the fair in September. So thank you so much for watching. This conversation will also remain available online afterwards at Market Art Fair's website and YouTube channel.
Hello and welcome, Nicolai Howalt. We're going to talk today about your series, Old Chico, which consists of 74 photographs, analog photographs of the same motif. It's a very special series because it's actually printed on vintage paper. Maybe you can tell about it yourself. How would you describe this piece?
The body of work of Old Chico is kind of a story or a project or an idea about how the oldest tree we know about look like when you do a photograph of it. And when I decide the way to do it, I decided to use only one negative, but instead of found a certain paper, I found kind of 100 different vintage papers that all was kind of, some of it was 80 years old, some of it was 20 years old, but it had different times, expiry dates. So it was all some kind of very old paper. And in that combination with this one negative, it comes out in so many different ways that when you're facing the body of work, you have the feeling of you have been there several times and seen several pictures of this tree, because the paper that where I exposed the photograph on react in so many different ways, even that it was the same method or the same process I went through, and therefore I found the whole idea of the work also is about what is a photograph and how do we understand a photograph when we're looking at it. Because my point of view is that there's a kind of a poetic combination between the papers and the tree and the age of the paper, like the age of the tree have. And therefore I found it kind of interesting to do it kind of so simple, just to have one single image, and then also try to fold it out in so many directions by choose so many different papers from so many different kind of areas. Like Soviet Union was a paper from Asia, there were paper from the United States and from Europe, and all these papers have so many different kind of way it was aged, so the result comes out in so many directions.
You talk a lot about the age of the tree and how it connects with the photograph, and how photographs is almost a capsule of time. Could you tell us a little bit about how you see time in a photograph? How is time related to this exact media?
Yeah, I mean, basically, is photograph always looking at something that we are looking back at. It's always been taken in the past, but at the same time, it's showing a photography is not so transparent medium we sometimes like to think it is, and therefore not to be kind of nostalgic or but more kind of try to go so deep in the single image and the single material of the idea that when we print an image, we also include the whole material from this paper that they come up with a voice of how we understand the image afterward, and that is kind of a very basic idea of the work. What was your question, actually?
It was actually how you relate time and photography. And I know that you sometimes talked about photography being a witness of time.
Yeah.
So if you could pinpoint what you mean by this, and especially in relation to the old Chico series.
I found it so gifted that we are standing here and dealing with the oldest tree in the world and looking at it on a photograph. And when you work with photography, like the light is kind of a basic thing for photography. The same is about time. It's kind of we have a camera where we open up a certain short time, a period where the light is kind of mirroring what you're pointing at, and then you expose an image that you bring out in the world, and you keep it in the camera. So for me, it's a time kind of a basic things about photography. And when I start working with this the world oldest tree, I found it so poetic in a way that even the paper, which also have and time things going on, because it was some of the paper was so old and have this expiry date that it was even older than my own mother and myself. Some of the paper, it have so many different ages. It makes so many marks on the result of what we're looking at, even that it was the same paper. So in that way, I found it so kind of connected to time and how we try to expose what time is and how we understand time.
Maybe it's also about life and how we change in life. And I mean, all these vintage papers, they've changed during all these years, and so has the tree. And that's the same for all of us. So it's interesting to see this development during all these years.
Yeah.
Which is also an impact of time.
Yeah.
So time is a very core topic, I think, in this piece, and it's a very interesting to think of because you also experience it in a kind of philosophical way. If you unfold it in these different topics.
Yeah, I think the body of work with Chico is also try to explore what we see when we look at a photograph.
I find it very interesting what you tell about also the vintage papers. so that the material actually becomes a very important part of the piece, and also in this concept of time. So what you did in this series is that you actually collected several different vintage papers, and you developed each picture on on a special paper with an outdated expiry. Could you tell us about the whole process behind this very special way of working with photography?
Yeah, I mean, this body of work is all of it is come out from this analog process with a negative where you go into the dark room and you print the positive on a paper that you develop and you fix them, and there after that you have the print. And I was kind of over the last years, because everything turned from the beginning where I started photographing, everything was analog, and then we have the whole digital era where we everything turned into be digital, and I somehow I went a little back to the analog method, because I thought there was some kind of gift to have by going in that direction. Also try to what I tried before to say about these timelines there are in the work of the old Chico. So what I found interesting was the whole way of the old material react today when it's kind of run out of this expiry date. So I realized a lot of the papers that I found many different places that was kind of 40, 60 years old still actually worked, but had a lot of new kind of it changed a lot in the surface, and you could call it mistakes or full of errors, but it comes out with some kind of other points that I couldn't control, which I found really interesting, because therefore you also have some kind of a talk or some kind of poetic links about what is age, what is time, what do we actually looking at. And at the same time, I found it kind of interesting by redo the same negative on these several. I mean, there was kind of 100 different papers, because it came out in so many different directions. So when you look at the body of work, you might in the beginning think there are several different kind of times I have paid visit to the tree in the winter time, in the summertime, but because you actually, the paper and the material start kind of tell us so many other things that we try to understand when we look at the photograph, which I found was interesting in the kind of idea of dealing with what do we see when we look at a photograph, even the same photograph, because we see so many different things into it, depending on what kind of papers and process it have been through. And at the same time, I because what I also got really fascinated by was when you normally work with photography and more kind of digital or analog processes, you are very much in control of every kind of centimeter of the process. But here it was some kind of a give up the whole control and let it over to the whole material. So what I did in the darkroom was actually just the same with every paper, but it came out in so many directions, because the papers and this kind of aging that the papers had went through come out with so many different kind of result in the end, which was kind of a big gift for me in the process.
I was just about to ask you, how do you actually feel about this loss of control as an artist and as a photograph, which is such a precise medium where you actually can be a witness of time, as you told before. How is that for you to work with?
I found it so fascinating, and I also, I mean, in the understanding of that, in the end of the day, I do all the decisions anyway. So what I got really into was in a way how you could say that I gave I let the material come into the conversation much more than if I had all in control, with letting out the control. So I found it kind of very interested to just to step a little backward and see what happened, and then do the whole kind of combination and look at the result in the end of the whole process, instead of having all the ideas lined up in the beginning and just do what I found was kind of make sense in the moment. So I found that way really interested also in artistic.
And how could you then, let me ask me, did you have any idea of how the individual pieces would come out? Because you had all these boxes with vintage papers from different years and different producers, different brands. Would you calculate, so this is an AGFA from 1953, it would be like seeing old Chico in a storm or on a sunny day, or would you think like that, or would it just be
Both. I mean, yes,
completely random?
it's pretty randomly how it reacts, because it depends on very much how it was stored over all these years. So it have stored in a very cold, wet room where it get very warm in the summer times. It was damaged much more fast, instead of it was stored in a fridge and have a stable temperature. So, but I got really fascinated by paper from the East Europe and Russia, because it was very clear that the paper thinness was much more thin, and the silver halides in the surface was much more less than in the Western photographic material. So it was kind of, I had this feeling that these rich countries have kind of much better qualities of papers in the beginning than they had in the East Europe. But on the other hand, was the paper from East Europe so kind of fragile in the surface. So it was kind of such a nice material to work on, because it had some other qualities, and it also kind of expired in another direction than the more kind of American papers and also Asian papers was. So you have some kind of, there was some kind of things that you could say that was very typical for different kind of brands and papers, and sometimes you just, or very often, I just got really kind of surprised about how it was reacting. So for my method or my strategy was kind of also to be very open-minded for what could be. So I had kind of more or less the same procedure when I did the darkroom work, and then just also to let out the result to the material was kind of also kind of a freedom to have, to say, okay, it doesn't really work very well, this paper, for some reason. It doesn't matter, I try with something else. And I found it also interesting because I found this kind of, I found this discussion with myself for many years. What is a photograph, and what do we look at when we see a photograph? Kind of really interesting, because we are surrounded by photographs from the internet and from the newspapers and everywhere, and it had this kind of it let us think that we are looking at something somebody saw, and we also do that. But I do believe the work here also have this quality that we are also looking of some kind of material that give us so much more that we're not even is so aware of when we got presented for all these images every day that we just see and consume in one take, and combine them very much into kind of an idea about the reality, which kind of is between us all. That so I found it much more complex and much more kind of fascinating than just kind of a single image.
What about then this repetition of the same motive? I mean, in the series you have the 74 different works, but it's all the same motive on these different papers. How can I say, what was your idea behind this repetition? What does repetition do to us, do you think?
Yes, I mean, I first of all, I thought it was kind of a beautiful, simple idea just to simply use one image, because of course I did several photographs of this tree, but I found it interesting to see how much I demonstrate by using that single image how different it actually can see depending on the material you're bringing it into. And I also found it interesting to do a body of work, a book, and a big show with only one picture of the tree, because when we go so deep into this image and the material, it's actually, I think it's so clear how huge an area it can be shown at, and how complex it can be read at when you see so many different results of the same picture. And that kind of very poetic line, it's kind of just a one liner, just repeated in different kind of tones. And I found that kind of so, as it is kind of very simple idea, but also a very poetic and beautiful way of dealing with the whole idea of what we see when we see a photograph, because we see so much more, or we understand so much more than just that single work. So I had always the feeling that, of course, I deal with this tree, and the tree have a kind of phenomenal history about this age it have, but it also about much more about what do we see when we see one image, and how do we read it, and how many different ways can we read it. So yeah.
I mean, most people, when they look at the work, they really think that it's not the same motive, that it takes some time actually to decode and to find out that it is just exactly the same photograph developed on different papers. I think it could be interesting if you could just tell us a little bit about the chemical process in the papers, because I know that of course it's a physical thing. There's a reason why these 74 motifs look so different. Could you just tell us shortly about that?
Yeah, it's very simple, because the chemical combination is quite the same all through all images. It's a paper that are eating in different ways, and a photographic paper is kind of a light sensitive paper that after it has some expiry date, and after that date run out, it becomes often kind of less contrast, and it can get very dark, or it can lose the effect of the silver, and there it can be kind of very hardly to expose anything on it. But the chemical process is totally the classic one where you expose the paper in the darkroom, you put it into the developer with the same kind of combination with water, and then you stop it in a stop water, and then you fix it and can bring it out in the daylight. So that is not the trick. The interesting part is when you have photographic paper that are way back from the 60s or even from the 30s, you can't really say, or you can't really know how it reacts after all these years, but there always something happened. It kind of breaks down. It fall apart in a way, and some of the silver halides start actually have that. That is a kind of a very weird thing, but the silver halides can actually move around on the paper, so it can group itself in areas where it get kind of more dark. So it's actually a material that you could say is pretty much alive. So it's uncontrollable. So that was some of that part that I got so fascinated by, that I had that kind of single image, and I simply did more or less, depending on the size of the paper, of course, giving the same amount of light, and then the chemical process was the same. And the result from that part was so in so many directions that was totally out of my control, and depends very much about how old the paper was, who was the brand behind, and how was it stored for all these years. So it of course, if you normally store it very dry and cold, it can remain for a much longer period and not much happens. But so when I bought in from eBay and other places a lot of old photographic material, a lot of it was also totally destroyed because somebody opened up the packet and said, "Oh, there's a lot of paper, we sell it." But then you destroy the paper because it can't take any light, and it get dark. So of course there was a lot of kind of mistakes and disappointment by working in that direction. But I also found it really kind of fascinating getting something totally new from a new box of paper that had been, for some reason, expired in another direction than the other ones had. And yeah.
I think here at the end of the interview, I think we should also talk about the language of the work. And you mentioned it yourself before that there is like a poetic quality in the series, in the repetition. And could you try and elaborate about the dialogue that your work creates with the viewer, and tell us about how you explore language in your art, in your photography?
Yeah, I mean, basically, when I starting up photographing, I had the feeling that I came into another level of a conversation that I had ever seen before, and that is also what I feel today when I do my photographing. That I found it like kind of much more combined to my personality to use that kind of to use my kind of to use this method in the way that I work, and what I found so interesting with this photography is also that is when we look at photography, we have the feeling that we are looking at something that someone saw somewhere in a given time, and the way I understand it is often that it gives me kind of a larger image of something. So it pointed something and put me into a direction that is a sentence that I have to end it myself. So I prefer to work with images that are opened, where there's a space for the viewer to be in, to questioning instead of answering, and therefore I mean, photography is just kind of a brilliant, because I found it kind of something that we all are pretty familiar with, and it always have this kind of link to a reality we knows about all of us. It comes out. Somebody saw something and took a photograph of it. I took a photograph of a tree, but at the same time, it's totally kind of a personal thing at the same time. It's and the way you understand the image, it's kind of, it's your right to understand it. So if anybody said he was in the wintertime, it was full of snow up there, it might be. I mean, it's up to you to see it and understand it. And I was in the night and do it in the nighttime. It's okay. It's what the viewer get out from the photograph that gives the meaning. And I like that kind of conversation, that there is not only one answer that's correct. It's totally up to how you see it and you read it. And therefore, I still got fascinated by working with it, both in a digital way, but absolutely also in an analog way.
And when you collected all these papers, did you know at that time that it would turn out into a series of Old Chico?
No, because the way I normally work is kind of, I got kind of interested in some things. I found it so fascinating with this tree, so I really would like to see it myself, but I have no idea how it should kind of be shown or how I should work with it. So that's a process that I normally went through always in all my works. I started one spot where I probably just want to try to get a little more idea about what this is, and then they open up so many kind of directions that I try to get into, and so in the process it comes out with the poetic combination with the old tree, the papers, and the age of the papers, and the age of the tree, and the way we see the difference by the same picture, but we see it in different ways. We understand it in different ways. It comes up in the process, and in the beginning I had the feeling that it was a kind of a brilliant project for a book where you would read every single page. So when we did the exhibition, I got kind of very surprised and happy for the way that suddenly the surface of each papers also come up to have kind of a certain role, and the size of the papers, where in the book all the pictures have the same page or the same size. So I found it kind of it's something that they grow and find kind of a way when I'm working with it, the whole process doing.
Thank you, Nicolai. I think time is almost up, and I think you told us a lot about your work. I think we all got much clever about the language of Old Chico and how you work with this motive and repetition and poetry in your piece. So thank you so much.
Okay.
And I think we also need to mention that actually it's also available in your book Old Chico. So it's both a book and a series of pieces.
Yeah, exhibition.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, good.